They told her it was mercy when they wrapped her in black and loaded her onto the wagon at dawn. Mercy when they said a widowed woman had no place lingering in her husband's house. Mercy when her mother would not meet her eyes and her brothers stood like fence posts with judgment nailed through them, because in their minds grief had made her useless, and a useless woman was a burden best sent away. And so they sent her west with nothing but a single trunk, a folded marriage certificate already yellowing at the creases, and a destination spoken in low, uneasy tones. The ranch of the cowboy no one visited unless forced. The man whose name was spoken like a warning rather than an introduction, a man rumored to have blood on his hands and silence in his soul. And as the wagon lurched forward and the dust rose thick and choking behind her, she understood the truth they would never admit. This was not mercy, it was punishment. Because she had survived her husband, because she did not cry prettily or beg to be kept, because she reminded them that love could end and leave ruin behind. And in a world that feared widows more than graves, they chose to exile her rather than confront their own terror of loss. The road stretched endlessly, sun-scorched and cruel, the driver speaking little except to warn her not to expect kindness where she was going, telling her the cowboy lived alone by choice, and that loneliness clung to him like a second skin, that men who crossed him rarely crossed him twice, and she listened without comment, hands folded over her lap, heart locked tight behind the quiet resolve she had learned in the weeks after her husband's burial, because grief had already hollowed her and fear could no longer claim much space inside her, not when the worst had already happened and she was still breathing. She remembered the way her husband's boots had remained by the door long after he was lowered into the earth, remembered how the house echoed with his absence, how the nights grew so loud with silence that she thought she might break, and yet she did not. And if she could survive that emptiness, then she could survive whatever waited at the end of this road, even if it was a man made of rumor and shadow. The ranch appeared suddenly as the land flattened and the sky widened. A spread of weather-beaten buildings crouched against the vastness, like they knew resistance was pointless, fences leaning, the main house dark and unwelcoming. And there he stood near the corral as the wagon slowed, tall and unmoving, hat pulled low, arms crossed as if he had been carved into the land rather than born of it. And she felt the weight of his gaze before she fully saw his face, a stare sharp enough to strip pretenses bare, eyes hard, unreadable, and unkind, a face worn by sun and something deeper, something older than age. The driver barely waited for him to approach before unloading her trunk, muttering a quick farewell that sounded more like relief. And then she was alone with the cowboy and the wind. The silence between them stretched tight as wire, his gaze traveling over her black dress, her bare hands, the lack of jewelry that marked her as already stripped of status. And when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, asking only if she could work, not her name, not her story, just whether her hands were strong enough to earn her keep. And she met his stare without flinching and answered yes, because survival had taught her the value of simple truths. He turned without another word, expecting her to follow, and she did, lifting her trunk herself when he made no move to help, because she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her struggle. And as she crossed the threshold of the house that would now confine her fate, she felt the final severing of her old life, the last thread tying her to family, to familiarity, snapping clean, leaving only uncertainty and a man who did not yet know that the punishment delivered to his door would one day become the one thing he never knew he needed, though for now all he saw was another obligation, another burden forced upon him by a world that never asked his consent. The days that followed were carved from labor and silence, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears until she learned to hear meaning in what was never said, because the cowboy did not speak unless necessary, and when he did his words were blunt tools, rather than bridges, assigning her tasks, without explanation, rising before dawn and expecting her to do the same, testing her not with cruelty but with indifference, as if neglect were a language he spoke fluently. And she learned quickly that the ranch ran on his rigid rhythm, animals fed at precise hours, fences mended without complaint, water hauled regardless of heat or exhaustion, and she matched him step for step, not because she sought his approval, but because work was a kind of mercy, something solid to hold onto when memories threatened to pull her under. Her hands blistered and split, black mourning fabric traded for coarse work dresses, the ache in her back becoming a familiar companion. And still he watched her from the corners of his vision, with something close to suspicion, waiting for weakness, waiting for tears or pleading that never came, because she had already cried all the tears she possessed, and there were none left to offer him. At night she slept in a small room off the kitchen, the bed narrow and unforgiving, the walls thin enough that she could hear his boots when he paced the house long after dark, a restless presence moving from room to room like a man who did not trust stillness, and sometimes she wondered if the rumors were wrong, if the violence people whispered about him was not something he inflicted outward, but something he carried inside, a wound that never closed, because there was a heaviness to him that went beyond anger, a gravity that bent the air around him. And when he thought himself alone, she caught glimpses of it, the way his shoulders sagged, when he sat at the table after supper, the way his gaze lingered on the horizon as if searching for something he had lost and could not name. The ranch itself bore the marks of long solitude. Dust settled thick on unused rooms, repairs made only when necessity demanded, nothing decorative, nothing soft, and she found herself cleaning not to please him but because order steadied her, because sweeping away grime felt like a small rebellion against the chaos that had swallowed her life, and though he never thanked her, he did not stop her either, a quiet allowance that felt almost like trust. The first true crack in his armor came one afternoon when a storm rolled in fast and violent, wind tearing across the plains and cattle spooking in the corral, and without a word he was already moving, expecting her to follow as she always did, rain slashing down hard enough to sting, mud sucking at her boots, and when a fence post gave way and a steer bolted, she ran without hesitation, skirt soaked and heavy, grabbing the rope he tossed her and bracing herself with a strength born, not of muscle but of will, holding fast even as the animal strained against them both. And in that moment his eyes met hers, not cold but sharp with something like surprise, as if he had not expected her to endure, to stand firm when tested. And when the steer was finally secured and the storm passed, leaving them drenched and breathless, he gave a single nod, not gratitude, not praise, but acknowledgement, and it felt heavier than either. That night at supper he spoke her name for the first time, testing the sound of it as though it might cut him, and she answered calmly, neither eager nor withdrawn, because she had learned that power often lay in quiet steadiness, and though the walls between them remained thick, something had shifted, something subtle and dangerous, because a man who feared attachment had just seen proof that the woman forced upon him was not fragile, not temporary, not easily broken, and the realization unsettled him more than anger ever could, stirring something buried deep beneath years of chosen isolation, something he had sworn would never again be allowed to surface. The tension between them did not soften after that day, it sharpened, drawn tighter by unspoken recognition and the slow, relentless awareness that neither of them was what the other had expected, because he began to notice the small ways she altered the ranch without ever asking permission, how she fixed a hinge instead of ignoring its squeal, how she coaxed life back into the neglected garden behind the house, how she sang softly when she thought herself alone, a low, broken melody that carried more ache than hope, and each sound of it cut through him like a blade, stirring memories he kept buried with deliberate care, memories of a woman who had once laughed in this very yard before blood and betrayal taught him the cost of caring too deeply. He caught himself watching her more often, not with desire but with wary curiosity, as if she were a problem he could not solve, a presence that refused to be neatly categorized as burden or threat, and it irritated him more than open defiance ever could, because she did not challenge him directly, she simply endured, meeting every harsh task with the same quiet resolve, never asking for relief, never reminding him that she had been sent here against her will, and the knowledge gnawed at him, because he recognized in her the same stubborn survival that had once defined him before the world stripped it raw. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and the day's work finally loosened its grip, he found her sitting on the porch steps, mending a torn shirt by lamplight, her fingers moving with practiced care, and without thinking he asked why she had been sent away, the question escaping him like a betrayal of his own rules, and she did not look up as she answered, her voice steady as she said her family believed a widowed woman carried misfortune, that her presence unsettled them, that it was easier to give her to a man already marked by darkness than to confront their own fear of becoming alone, and something in his chest twisted at that, an old, familiar anger flaring to life, not for himself but for her, because he understood too well what it meant to be branded and discarded. He said nothing in response, retreating into silence as he always did. But that night sleep would not come, his thoughts circling the idea that punishment had been delivered to his door, in the shape of a woman who asked for nothing yet gave everything. She had, and the realization unsettled him more than any rumor ever could, because it forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. That solitude had kept him safe, but it had also kept him empty, and now that emptiness had been disrupted by a presence too resilient to ignore and too wounded to dismiss. Days later, when a neighboring rancher rode in with accusations and veiled threats over grazing land, his temper flared fast and dangerous, words turning sharp as knives, and when the man insulted her without knowing her worth, calling her a burden and worse, something in him snapped clean, his fist landing before thought could intervene, the violence swift and decisive. And though he sent the rancher away bruised and furious, the aftermath left him shaken, because the fury that rose in him had not been for pride or land but for her dignity. And when he turned to find her watching from the doorway, fear flickering briefly in her eyes before being replaced by understanding, he realized with a jolt that he had crossed a line he could not uncross. Later that night he tried to harden himself again, tried to retreat behind the walls he had built with such care, but the truth pressed in relentless and unyielding. She was no longer just a punishment forced upon him, and he was no longer untouched by her presence, because somewhere between grief and labor and unspoken loyalty, a bond had begun to form, fragile and dangerous, promising both salvation and ruin. And though neither of them yet dared to name it, the cowboy understood with grim certainty that the widowed woman sent to break him might instead become the one thing capable of undoing him entirely. Winter came early and hard, as if the land itself sensed the shift between them and sought to test what had quietly taken root, the cold biting deep into bone and resolve alike. And with it came a closeness neither of them could avoid, storms trapping them indoors for days at a time, the ranch shrinking until every sound felt amplified, every glance heavy with meaning. And though the cowboy said little, his awareness of her presence grew constant and inescapable. The way she moved through the house with careful confidence, no longer tentative but not presumptuous either, as if she understood instinctively how to occupy space without claiming it. And that understanding unsettled him because it mirrored his own long practice of existing without being seen. The nights were the worst, wind howling like a living thing, rattling the walls and dragging memories to the surface. And on one such night he woke to the sound of her crying, soft and restrained, grief leaking through the cracks of her composure. And though every instinct urged him to remain where he was, to let silence swallow the moment as it always had, something stronger compelled him forward, his steps hesitant as he stopped outside her door, listening as she whispered her dead husband's name like a prayer. And in that instant he understood that her strength was not the absence of pain, but the decision to carry it without surrender, a realization that struck him with unexpected force, because it echoed too closely the way he carried his own ghosts. When he finally spoke her name through the thin barrier of wood, the sound startled them both, and she opened the door with red-rimmed eyes and a face stripped of all defenses. And there was no fear in her gaze now, only exhaustion and quiet, acceptance, and without planning it he sat beside her on the edge of the bed, the space between them narrow and charged, neither reaching out yet neither pulling away. And he told her, haltingly and without detail, that he understood what it meant to be blamed for surviving, that the world had a way of punishing those who remained when others were gone. And she listened without interruption, without judgment, offering him the same gift he had unknowingly given her from the beginning, the dignity of being heard. After that night something shifted irreversibly. The silence between them no longer empty, but weighted with unspoken care. And though he still pushed himself hard and expected the same of her, there was a subtle change in his watchfulness, a readiness to step in before she overextended, a quiet insistence that she rest when illness threatened, gestures so small they could be denied yet too consistent to ignore, and she accepted them without gratitude or resistance, understanding that this was the only language of concern he knew how to speak. The ranchers nearby began to take notice, rumors stirring like old embers as word spread that the feared cowboy now housed a woman not broken but steady, and suspicion followed swiftly on the heels of curiosity, because a man like him was not meant to change. And when strangers rode past the ranch more frequently, lingering too long at the fence, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to protect sharpening into something fierce and uncompromising, not because he feared for himself, but because he had learned, too late and too painfully once before, what it cost to fail someone who depended on him. One afternoon, as she tended the animals with practiced ease, he watched her from the barn doorway and understood with a clarity that left him reeling that she had become woven into the fabric of his days so completely that the thought of losing her struck deeper than solitude ever had. And it terrified him, because love, if that was what this was, had already ruined him once. And yet as he stood there in the cold light of winter, he knew with a certainty that could not be argued away that sending her back, pushing her away, pretending indifference, would be a violence greater than any he had ever committed. And the knowledge settled heavy and irrevocable in his chest, marking the beginning of a choice that would demand everything he had left to give. The choice, once acknowledged, refused to remain silent, pressing in on him through every decision, every moment of restraint, because caring for her altered the shape of his days in ways he could no longer deny. And when trouble finally came, it did so with the inevitability of a storm long visible on the horizon, riding in the form of men who believed fear still ruled him, men who remembered his past and sought to use it, claiming old debts and old blood as justification for new threats. And when they arrived at the ranch under the guise of negotiation, their eyes lingered on her with calculating interest, weighing her not as a person but as leverage. And something in him went cold and precise, the kind of calm that preceded violence he could not afford to unleash. He kept his voice even, his posture loose, while every instinct screamed for confrontation, and she sensed the danger immediately, moving closer to him without a word, a quiet alignment that did not go unnoticed by the men who watched them with narrowed eyes, because unity was a language they understood too well, and it unsettled them. The tension stretched until words became weapons, accusations thrown and returned. And when one man reached for her arm in a deliberate provocation, the cowboy's control shattered, his reaction swift and brutal, a reminder of why his name still carried weight. And though the men retreated bruised and furious, promising to return with numbers and purpose, the aftermath left the air thick with unspoken fear, because he knew violence only invited more violence, and this time the consequences would not fall on him alone. That night he told her the truth he had avoided for years, that his past was soaked in blood not because he sought it, but because he had once loved someone who was taken from him, that his retaliation had earned him survival at the cost of exile, and that every mile of distance he had put between himself and the world had been an attempt to ensure no one else paid for his attachments. And she listened with a stillness that held no condemnation, only understanding, because grief had taught her that loss did not make monsters, only men forced into impossible choices. She told him then that she did not fear his past, that she feared a future shaped by silence and avoidance. And her words struck deeper than accusation ever could, because they demanded responsibility rather than retreat. And for the first time in years he considered the possibility that protection did not always require isolation, that strength might exist in shared resolve rather than solitary endurance. The days that followed were tense and watchful, preparations made without panic but with purpose, fences reinforced, supplies gathered, contingency plans spoken aloud for the first time. And through it all she remained steady at his side, neither pleading nor passive, and her presence altered the weight of the threat, transforming it from a burden he carried alone into a trial they faced together. And though fear lingered, it no longer ruled him, because something stronger had taken root, something that demanded action not for pride or survival, but for the preservation of a fragile, hard-won bond when the men finally returned under cover of dusk, intent on forcing submission. They found a ranch no longer governed by rumor and intimidation, but by resolve, and though the confrontation that followed was swift and violent, ending with the men driven off for good, the cost was paid in blood and pain. And when the dust settled and he lay injured but alive, it was her voice that anchored him, her hands steady as she bound his wounds, refusing to let him slip back into the darkness that had claimed him before. And in that moment, as he watched her work with fierce concentration and unyielding care, he understood that she had already crossed every boundary he had erected, becoming not a weakness to be guarded, but a force that strengthened him. And the realization changed the shape of his fear into something he could finally confront rather than flee. Recovery was slow and unforgiving, each day measured not in triumphs but in small acts of persistence. And during that time the balance between them shifted fully and finally, because the cowboy, stripped of his physical strength, was forced to confront the truth of how deeply she had become essential to his survival, not as a caretaker alone, but as the steady presence that kept him tethered to the world. When frustration and old instincts urged him toward withdrawal, and she did not coddle him or allow self-pity to take root, meeting his darker moods with firm patience and quiet expectation, reminding him through action rather than words that healing was not a solitary act. As he grew stronger, the ranch followed suit, no longer a place merely endured, but one actively shaped by their shared effort. Laughter soft and surprised finding its way into the house in unguarded moments. And though neither spoke openly of love, it lived in the spaces between them, in the way he watched her when she worked, in the way she anticipated his needs without erasing her own, and the unspoken understanding bound them more securely than vows ever could. When spring finally broke the grip of winter, the land responding with stubborn green shoots pushing through thawed earth, he took her to the far edge of the property where the horizon stretched wide and unclaimed, and there he told her that he would not send her away, not now, not ever, that whatever punishment had delivered her to him had misjudged them both, and that if she chose to stay, it would be as his equal, not his burden. And her answer came without hesitation, because she had already chosen him in 100 quiet ways long before that moment. And as they stood together beneath the open sky, the past loosened its hold at last, grief no longer a chain, but a scar that marked survival rather than defeat. Word eventually spread that the feared cowboy had changed, that his ranch was no longer a place of exile, but one of fierce loyalty and hard-won peace. And though some spoke of the widowed woman as his redemption, those who truly understood knew the truth was more complicated and more powerful, that she had not saved him by softening his edges, but by standing unbroken beside him, and in doing so had claimed a future neither of them had believed possible. In the end, the punishment meant to erase her became the path that revealed her worth, and the man who had been warned against all attachments found his greatest treasure, not in land or reputation, but in the woman who arrived with nothing, and gave him everything that mattered, a bond forged not by promise but by endurance, loyalty, and the quiet courage to choose each other in a world that had tried relentlessly to take them apart.